Hey, what's up, YouTube? So I'm doing a second video out on my porch today, and I printed out some notes. I printed out some notes so that I would just be able to read off of, so that this video has some like preconceived ideas in it, so that I'm not just speaking off the top of my head. But I wanted to make a video titled How to Use Your Knowledge. And so how I define knowledge is like it can be creativity. It can be any kind of creativity, or it could be like if you're really good at, like, let's say you're a chef, like you're really good at cooking, or or it could be like a spiritual thing, like if you're spiritually inclined and you and you have a lot of like spiritual knowledge or whatever. Like anything that requires like a book's worth of knowledge at your disposal that you can use to like help people or teach people, like that's essentially knowledge. And so I wrote down some things that are kind of like my own personal knowledge, or it's like a small portion of it. And they're just ideas and concepts that I've kind of collected over time that I think can clarify some of the creative process, or some of the process that you have like on YouTube and stuff like that. So I'll just start by reading down the list. And I wanted to start with a short story time from one of my favorite YouTubers. Ribby, what you doing? Come here. Come here. Come here. Come here. My dogs are on the deck with me. They don't know what to do. But I wanted to start with a little story time from one of my favorite YouTubers, and also one of my teachers. He's kind of like a spiritual like teacher, but it's called The Story of the Elk Man and the Elk Dreamer. And essentially the story is that there's this elk spirit, right, residing in the skull of an elk, and it is just out there in the nature, and it essentially calls to men who are out hunting, and they hear the voice of the elk spirit, and they follow the voice to the elk skull, and then they come upon the elk skull, and essentially the elk skull tells them that hey, I can give you a power, or I can give you knowledge to essentially help a lot of people in your community who are sick from various types of illnesses. And he says, I can give you this power, this knowledge, but he doesn't explicitly tell them this, but essentially he puts them to the test, whether this is the right type of man for the job. And how he tests them is he asks them to bring a flute with them to where the elk skull is, right where the spirit is attached to. They bring the flute, and essentially he says, put it up to your mouth. So they put the flute up to their mouth, and essentially the flute starts playing its own song, and 4 butterflies from the elk skull go out from the skull and go into the flute, and then they go into the man who's taking the test. And if they pass the test, then 2 of those butterflies will come out of their body. They'll come out through the hands. They'll essentially come out through the hands, and they've passed the test, and now they have the knowledge and the wisdom and whatever to help people. But if they don't pass the test, then all 4 butterflies stay within the body, and they corrupt the body. They essentially make the body sick. And so essentially the very illness that the knowledge can treat is now you have that thing because you didn't pass the test, because you're not the right man for the job. And so that's a very shortened version of the story, but that's essentially kind of the sum of the story. And the major difference between, besides passing the test, and besides, you know, being healthy and only having 2 butterflies versus being unhealthy and having 4 butterflies, the main difference between an elk man who doesn't pass the test and an elk dreamer who does pass the test is the man who's the right for the job can actually use his knowledge and can actually use it to help people. And the elk man who doesn't pass the test is unable to use his knowledge to help people because he's being corrupted by the very medicine that is supposed to help people. So that's essentially my first marker on here. That's my first bullet point. And then I don't know, I'm not sure if I should jump around on this list or just go through it from top to bottom. So I'm not going to change the subject, but I'm essentially moved to something a little different, which is that the author of Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin, said that if he could go back to being 35 again, 35 years old, and if he could clone himself, then he probably would have finished The Winds of Winter by now. Because 35 is when he got the idea for Game of Thrones. It's when the first chapter came to him. The other author who had a similar kind of interview, J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, said that the idea for Harry Potter dropped into her head as she was riding a train. Like, literally the whole premise for the story just came to her out of the blue. And so, yeah, those are 2 authors who had kind of a similar kind of sounding experience. If you look at most authors, most of them write their best stories between the ages of 35 and 40. And sorry, I have this really bad infection in my throat right now. Oh, fuck, my paper. My paper just flew off the deck. Okay, I have to pause this video, go get it. Alright, I got my paper. So, I was saying that most authors get their ideas between the ages of 35 and 40. Now I'm going to introduce this idea, this theory that I've had for a long time called 35 to 40 being the second puberty. And so it seems to me that anybody over the ages of 35 kind of, not everyone, but a lot of people kind of, you know, make ends meet and kind of figure out their life after 35. And it's also where a lot of ideas creatively hit people from like 35 to 40. And so I think there's something special about that time, just like there's something special about childhood and your first puberty. There's something special about the years of 35 to 40. And I think I could tack on to my theory a couple different examples of what I mean, which is like, right, the example of George R.R. Martin talking about if he could clone himself at 35, he'd have the series done. And then J.K. Rowling saying, yeah, when I was, a decade ago, the idea dropped into my head. And if you look at how old she is now, like a decade or 2 decades ago would have been around this time. So I'll just skip down the page a little bit, and I'll go to one of these points I made, which is called waiting patiently for the creativity versus trying to force yourself to produce work when you're young. So if it is true that 35 to 40 is like a second puberty in a manner of speaking, and that most people kind of figure out their life at that point, then if you try to force yourself to produce um, if you try to force yourself to produce like art, or I mean, like, you know, lots of people are very good at what they do from a young age, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, obviously people are born with like talents, but for people who talk about creativity all the time, um, you know, trying to force it before it's time versus waiting patiently for those years to come on. And, you know, so basically waiting patiently for those years versus trying to force yourself to produce work is like, which are you going to choose to do? So I'll ignore some of the points I have on here and skip down, which is whatever you practice now grows exponentially on the other side of 40. So essentially whatever you practice now, whether it's spirituality or, you know, you like to produce music or art or like whatever it is, like that will grow exponentially on the other side of 40. It'll start growing, start like building up like from 35 onward, but once you turn 40, it's like anything you haven't practiced before 35 gets out of your reach. And so, you know, you have to practice something now so that by that time it starts taking on a life of its own. Kind of like how authors will have an idea for a story, but it won't really take off for several years. So I plan to cover as much ground as possible while making designs as to what to keep and practice and what ought to be left alone. So for me personally, like a couple of years ago, I thought, yeah, I went skydiving one time, and I thought, wouldn't it be really cool to get a skydiving license and essentially be like a skydiving like professional and teacher. But I thought, but what about exercise? What if I'm not really like doing any exercise? Like which one is better? And so I thought, if I had to choose between skydiving and exercise, I'd probably have to choose exercise just to be a little bit more wise, just to be a little bit more like practical. And then the same thing could be said for writing novels versus teaching, like which is more practical. You know, there's a lot of writers out there who are very successful, and I've started writing a story and I like how it's going so far, but like, what's more practical in the long run? Like, is it going to be writing novels, or is it going to be teaching? Am I gonna try and rely on books to bring in my paycheck, or am I gonna rely on something more steady like teaching? And which one is gonna bring me more like joy, basically? I think midlife crises are proof of this theory that I have, which is like between 35 and 40, there's like a second puberty. And I think a midlife crisis, the fact that so many people have them, so many men have them, is like proof. Is proof because Like, if you think about it, like most... Ribby, stop. Our neighbor's just pulling into their driveway. But, like, a lot of guys get, like, fancy cars and, like, new girlfriends, or, like, they leave their wife for, like, a new girlfriend. And it happens a lot. It happens to a lot of guys, so that could be proof of it, essentially. Now I'm going to go to another proof, which is 2 chapters of the Bible. One of them is Jesus's parable about the workers in the field getting paid the same. And the other one is the part where he starts baptizing people, and he says you need to be born again. Or you need to be born in the Spirit. And so if you think about it, like, if 35 to 40 was like a second puberty, and if everybody goes through it, like if both men and women go through it at that time, then it doesn't matter whether you've been creative for a super long time, or if you're just creative like a couple years before you reach that point. Like, the pay is the same. Like, if you start writing books in your like late 20s or early 30s, then you could be a successful author. Or if you started writing when you were a little kid, like, maybe you have even greater chances of being a successful author. But really, like, the pay is the same. Like, you're both authors, you both get paid to write books. Like, it's the same thing. And then Jesus says be born again in the Spirit, and it's like, that's just another like thing I like tack on to this theory of mine, which I've said like probably 100 times in this video already. But yeah, if you're like born again in the Spirit, it's kind of like you have to, like, whoever you are during that time, that's who you're stuck with the rest of your life. And there's a lot of like teachings in the Tao, or like in Chinese philosophy, that talk about like enlightenment and stuff, and I think this is kind of where it's coming from, to be honest. So yeah, to basically sum up the video, like, to use your knowledge, and to have like kind of like, you can call it like a medicine or a wisdom or something, like to have a medicine or a wisdom that actually helps people like change their lives, like that only comes like after 40 basically. And if you try really hard to get it, then you might not get it. But if you wait patiently for it and kind of build a subtle, quiet practice now that you don't have to put on blast on the internet, then you might actually gain some of that medicine or some of that wisdom used to like help people, essentially. What is it, Ribby? Just barking at our neighbor. So anyways, that's my whole video. I went through my list right here. I just typed it up like literally like an hour ago, and thought it'd be a good idea for a video, because I've put all these ideas in my head together, and that's pretty much the majority of them. I don't know how this video will hit for you guys, but I don't even know if it makes sense to anybody else besides me. But if it does make sense, then yay, we're on the same wavelength, the same vibration. If it doesn't make sense, then that's perfectly okay, you know. I hear stuff all the time from other YouTubers, and I go, that doesn't make like any sense to me. So anyways, peace guys, peace and love. Bye.